All right, how's everybody doing? Looks like we are live. Welcome to another episode of Sasquatch Out of the Shadows Live. I'm your host, Alex Pedikov, as always. Just a quick reminder, check out the previous shows. Last week we had a recap episode talking about chasing legends and our expedition to Arizona recently, looking for the Mogollon Monster. That was pretty fun. Next week we're going to have on Paul Bartholomew of Whitehall, New York, who's an awesome author and somebody I just met recently while I was in upstate New York. He's been researching the Whitehall incident, all the other Bigfoot encounters in the Northeast, and especially New York State and the Whitehall area for a long time. So I'm really excited to have him on. Uh, my website store on Pedicab Media is actually fixed now. So Square, they changed some of the stuff on the online website. I know I was getting some emails, people saying they couldn't find certain things or something was wrong with the website. I know it was because of the Square changing their policies. So if you guys want, go on there, check it out. Still have some lines of the East DVDs, comic books, all that kind of stuff. So feel free to check it out. But tonight I'm joined by paranormal researcher and author Kevin Foster. So Kevin concentrates on Sasquatch reports coming from the New England area. Over the past 20 years, he has had numerous encounters with the wild man in Vermont, Maine, and the Everglades of Florida. These sightings led to his investigation of the many cryptid tales told for centuries of strange creatures lurking about. This ultimately brought him to the Hockomock Swamp, which sits in the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts. This is an area that I've talked about before. I have a documentary on the channel about this, so it'd be great to talk about that. But Kevin actually wrote a book called Strange Days in the Hockomock Swamp. The book is filled with ghosts, UFOs, devil dogs, thunderbirds, pukwudgies, Bigfoot, and other creatures said to inhabit this area the early settlers called the Devil's Swamp. Kevin uses some of his own personal experiences with the paranormal to add to the plot line of the story. Very cool. So let's bring in Kevin. Hey, how you doing, Kevin?
I'm good. How are you tonight?
Good, good. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Great. So obviously you are from the New England area as well, like myself. You're very interested in a lot of the reports and stuff around here, just like me. But what initially got you interested in the subject of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Bridgewater Triangle? What was kind of the what brought you into it?
Well, I've actually always been kind of fascinated with Bigfoots. Ever since I was a kid, I saw the legend of Boggy Creek, which actually scared the hell out of me. I couldn't sleep that night. But then the past 20 years, I've had like numerous encounters. My first encounters actually happened all within a week. I was up at Copscoat State Park, which is like 3/4 of the way up in Maine. And I was walking with my kids that were like 8, 13 at the time. We were walking up this trail, and I was ahead of them because they were kind of lagging behind. And I came up over this ridge, and about 100 yards away down on the other side was this black creature, like bent over, and it was taking its arm and like pounding the ground. At first, I thought it was a bear, so I'm like, well, I better get my kids and get out of here. But all of a sudden, the thing stood up. It must have been like 8 feet tall. It turned sideways. I could see the profile. It definitely had like a monkey looking face. And I saw in its hand a red squirrel, and it just like took off into the woods. It never saw me, but that was my first encounter, and it pretty much scared me when I saw that. But so anyway, the next day I took my kids up this other trail, and we went out in this field, and I found huge mounds of, it looked like giant human poop. And when I was looking at it, there was like 5 different clusters of it. They were all filled with blueberries and rodents and red squirrels, and I can tell you they weren't bear poop. So that was my first encounter. I actually dropped my kids off and went to Vermont to stay at my brother's house to paint some walls for him. I was up at the house alone, and I took a break and ended up walking down this snowmobile trail with my dog. And there was like cornfield on the right, and it was probably like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're walking down this trail, and all of a sudden, my dog just started going nuts. He was like barking at this huge spruce tree. And I'm telling him, be quiet, calm down and everything. And all of a sudden, this spruce tree started shaking violently. And there was this like real deep guttural growl coming from the tree. And at first, again, I thought this was a bear. And then I saw this arm holding the tree, and I could see the fist gripping it and just shaking it violently. And by that time, my dog had just turned around and taken off. So I got the hell out of there and took off. So that night, I was sleeping, and all of a sudden, my dog woke up in the middle of the night, and he's barking like crazy again. So he's at this window. I go to this window. I'm like 3 stories up, looking out over this field, and I see these headlights. And I'm thinking, it's an ATV coming down the snowmobile trail. Well, all of a sudden, these headlights like disappeared, or I should say, separated from each other, and took off in different directions. And they started looping around the field. And I'm like, wow, these are the orbs I've been hearing about. And I'm watching them, and my dog's going crazy, barking at them. And all of a sudden, the orbs just took off into the woods. And I saw this shadow out in the middle of the field, which I thought was a bush at the time, stood up and just started walking away to the tree line. And it was, again, like an 8-foot tall shadow walking into the trees. So from that point, I started doing my research online and reading about things, and that brought me to the Hockomock Swamp. And as you just said, there's all kinds of stories coming out of there. From Hockomock actually means place where spirits dwell.
Right.
Yeah, so that started me doing my research and then got me into writing this book.
Very cool. So, I mean, you obviously had some sort of an encounter initially in Maine. Was there any, did you want to continue any research in Maine, or kind of did that spark any interest in what was going on in Maine in that particular area?
Yeah, I've actually been back to Maine a couple different times. Actually, 3 years ago, I had another encounter. I was staying at my son's house. He lives on Great Wast Island, which is near Jonesport, Maine. And I was taking my granddaughter for a walk to this pond. And when we got there, there was a seagull out in the middle of the pond, and it was like flapping around, but it couldn't take off. So I thought maybe a snapping turtle had it or something like that. And I noticed that it had a slashed neck, and it was bleeding from its neck, and it just kept flopping around. And I'm like, wow, that's really weird. So I said to my granddaughter, let's walk around the pond and go to the other side and see if we can get a better view of the seagull. We started around this corner, and all of a sudden, again, I heard this deep guttural growl, and this big spruce tree that was there started shaking again, just like what happened to me in Vermont. And I just looked at my granddaughter. I said, do you hear that? And she says, yeah. And I said, turn around and run. So run back to my son's house. So she started heading back, and all of a sudden I heard crashing coming off behind from where this spruce tree was shaking. And I'm like, there's definitely more than one here. So I ended up taking off and grabbing my granddaughter, and we headed back to the house. But I've had quite a few encounters.
Right. So, I mean, in that encounter, your granddaughter, was she pretty shaken up, or what was
Yeah,
her
she
initial
was.
reaction?
She at first she thought it was a bear, and she was kind of scared that I told her to run. So
Right, right. And in terms of just the other encounters as well, I mean, do you think that it's something that you've sort of just stumbled upon, or why do you think that you've had, these encounters in different areas of New England?
well, for one thing, I'm very outdoorsy, so I spend a lot of times out in the woods, a lot of times alone too, which I shouldn't do. After hearing about 411 missing people, but I don't know. Someone said I'm kind of a magnet for things like that because I've also seen ghosts. I've seen the orbs. I've seen UFOs. Um, but it just fascinates me.
Right. So, what was it about the Hockomock Swamp specifically that attracted you to that area? You obviously did your book about that sort of area. What was it that kind of sparked your interest more than continuing in other areas, I suppose?
Just because, well, number one, it's very close to me. It's about 45 minutes away, so I can get up there and get into the swamp and look around. But it was fascinating how many stories came out of this place over hundreds of years, ever since the first settlers came here, and the stories of Indian ghosts that people have seen in canoes and dancing around at night. And there's just so many Sasquatch sightings that actually come out of this place. It was just amazing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area for those that don't know. We'll talk a little bit about the Bridgewater Triangle, but yeah, we talked about it briefly last week on our show as we were talking with Chasing Legends. We did our pukwudgie episode where we kind of went around the Freetown State Forest, and we filmed a little bit by the power lines near the swamp right before the coronavirus declaration of emergency in Massachusetts, like 3 days before. So we lucked out in terms of time. I have another video on this channel from 2017, I believe, which is Bigfoot in the Bridgewater Triangle. I talked to a local researcher there, and I know a lot of friends in the New England area who are involved in that thing. Actually, later this month on our show, we will have on Aaron Kaju, who directed the now very popular on Amazon and other places Bridgewater Triangle documentary, which I feel is the best sort of piece primer about that sort of area. It talks about everything from the ghosts to the Native American stories to the Bigfoot and everything in between. So that'll be a good show. But do you maybe want to say a little bit about the Bridgewater Triangle for those that aren't aware of what it might be?
Well, Bridgewater Triangle was something that Lauren Coleman actually came up with. It covers, like, I think 5 different towns, and it's a triangle. The Hockomock Swamp sits like directly in the middle of this place. The Hockomock Swamp is like a 17,000 acre parcel of land. And as you said before, there's been reports of giant snakes as big as stovepipes, the pukwudgies, thunderbirds, devil dogs, even pterodactyls, UFOs, orbs. It's just like a portal for all these things to come out of. And I kind of like snuffed at the idea of portals before, but I'm really starting to think that there might be something behind that this is like a portal, a gateway to strange creatures coming in.
Right. Yeah. So for folks that aren't aware, just go ahead and Google it. It's pretty famous. I think they're even talking about doing an FX fictional show about the Bridgewater Triangle, or at least basing it in the Bridgewater Triangle. So it's an area that over the years has definitely become very prominent, especially when you talk about it online. And Lauren Coleman, of course, coined the term Bridgewater Triangle in the 70s. And it was sort of a play on the Bermuda Triangle, which was popular at the time. And, that a triangle is just something that people associate with geographically, even though technically it's not really a triangle. There's stuff that happens outside of the geographic radius of a triangular shape. But in our minds, it's easy to visualize it as a triangle that has a nice sort of ring to it. It's a pretty cool area. I've spent some time down there, like I said, even just recently, but a few years ago, I was stomping around the Hockomock Swamp. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Hockomock Swamp a little bit specifically. What has your research kind of led you to feel about it, or where did you first start looking into the Hockomock Swamp?
Actually, I think it was about 5 years ago. I started researching different articles. The Boston Herald came out with something. I can't think of the guy's name, but he was like walking along an embankment, following a trap line, and he smelled something really bad. He looked up on the embankment, and he saw this huge, like 8-foot brown creature walking along the top of it. He said he didn't see him, and it actually came down the embankment and walked right by him. There was another story of a guy that was in a canoe, and it was the same thing. He was heading down in this river, and he looked up and he saw this creature, and he's actually been going back like for years, but he's never seen it again. But there's just so many stories of these different things. That pukwudgies actually fascinate me. They're kind of like either naked or partly clothed, and they're small 3-foot tall creatures that look kind of like elfish, and there's been a lot of stories that have come out of there about them too.
Yeah, yeah. I think those stories you actually mentioned in the beginning. There was one of them. He was a trapper in the area, and that's exactly it. He had an encounter, and the other one was actually Joseph DeAndre, who I interviewed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Joseph, the video I have, if you guys want to go back to, I think it's episode, I'm going to say 4 or 5 of the documentary series on this channel. I interviewed Joseph in it, and he talks about the sighting, and yeah, it was that sort of, he saw it on an embankment. It kind of came down. He was kind of confused, and he's sort of been looking for it ever since. At least this was back in 2017 when I talked to him last. I don't know if he's still looking, but I know at the time he was still on the search and looking for people to join his team. So yeah, definitely an interesting area. It's a pretty creepy swamp. I mean, when I've been in the area, I mean, I've flown my drone over, and there's some spots that you really can't get into. I mean, for fear of quicksand or even wearing boots or anything like that. I don't know how difficult it would be to actually get into some of those deeper areas. Have you spent any time trying to get into some of the spots?
No, I've basically been around like the perimeter areas. I haven't gotten deep into the swamp yet. I actually was planning an expedition like back in April, but then we got hit with the pandemic, and that really messed up my plans. I was actually going to do a kayak excursion into it with a couple other buddies of mine, and we're waiting for the pandemic to, get rid of it. But
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things. I think getting in with a boat would probably be easier than trying to go on foot in some of these areas, right?
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of riverways that you can get through, a lot of the swamp, and there's actually a big island too in the middle of I forget the name of the lake, but there's stories that come from there that people have been canoeing around that, and then they've seen like monkey-like creatures on the embankments, and so it's just chock full of different stories there.
Right. Yeah, it's absolutely an interesting area. It's got a long history, and as you mentioned, even just going back to the King Philip
Philip.
War. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was so much history and a lot of bloodshed in that area, and this was not too far from Plymouth Colony, some of the early foundations of the United States, or at least the colonies in America, in the New World, and a lot of bloodshed and supposedly curses placed on some of these areas. And there's a rich history of folklore in the area. But the Hockomock Swamp, as you said, was called the place where spirits dwell. Now, do you have any working theories about why you think the Native Americans may have been so, I guess, fearful of this area? They didn't really like to go in that area. At least the Wampanoags were not a huge fan of the swamp. Do you have any idea why?
I think partly because of the different cryptid creatures that are in there, Sasquatch, and, hauntings of ghosts, devil dogs, giant cougars. I've heard, run through there too. I think they just find it a very strange place, and they'd rather avoid it. And I think the early settlers came up with the best name, the Devil's Swamp. I mean, anything with devil in it, most people try to avoid.
Right. So even to this day, there isn't a lot of housing and development in some. There are some streets that cut through the area, but there's still huge swaths of the swamp that you're just laying there, just kind of. People go dirt biking around the power lines, as far as I know. I mean, you can't really go in the summertime. I can imagine now going down there, it would just be absolute nightmare with all the bugs and creepy crawlies around there, let alone all the things that are reported in there.
Especially with the giant black snakes. They're supposedly as thick as stovepipes, so that's something I'd want to avoid.
Yeah, well, I was actually just in Arizona recently, and one of the guys who runs a cryptozoology organization out there, Alex Hearn, he's originally from Massachusetts. He's from Quincy, and he's been living out in Arizona now since 2005, so he's more into the cryptids out there. But he talked about living right in Bridgewater, Mass, and having some sort of an encounter at night where something was stealing rabbits, and it was this giant bird-like creature, and it was not far from the power line area of the Hockomock Swamp, which I think is a pretty easy way to get into kind of some of the areas where you can walk through, at least where there's dirt and trail.
Yeah, that's another thing that they talk about too, is what they call the thunderbird, those giant birds. So maybe that's something he was encountering there.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we'll start looking at some questions here that we're getting in. Lots of folks from, again, tuning in from all over the country and all over the world. Thank you guys as always. So we'll start out with a question from Stefan. Kevin, do you ever bring your dog out into the field with you? I can imagine it could warn you of possible cryptids.
Uh, I've had two different dogs that I have, yeah, taken out in the woods with me, and they have warned me about cryptids. Like I said, my dog was barking when I was up in Vermont twice and alerted me. Actually, when I was up in Great Wallis Island in Maine, though, I had a golden retriever with me, and he actually didn't even sense the creature, which was kind of strange. But yeah, I've had dogs and brought them out with me.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that from some folks as well. I don't know. I mean, it kind of depends, I suppose, on what kind of dog you have. I've heard, at least from my experience, encounters that say people's dogs are petrified. They don't even want to go outside the house when there's something going on, or
Yeah.
some dogs are really interested. I think it probably depends on the dog and the level of training. I'd imagine you don't want your dog running off and chasing anything in the woods. I'm sure you don't want to get your dog getting into a porcupine or anything like that. Sort of more mundane thing it might encounter.
Well, it's funny, the profile picture that you had up of me, I've got my newest dog, Loki, in the picture, and he's got a chain. I had him chained to a tree because we were flying drones there. But somebody saw the picture and said, "What are you leaving the dog out there as bait for the Bigfoots?" No.
You just didn't. Was he trying to get after the drone, or what was?
Yeah, he was chasing the drone. So we had a pine tree right there, and we just, put him there to keep him out of the drone. But
yeah, I've had that happen too, where be flying my drone and the dog will get a little too excited and either got to hold them back because those rotors, if you get hit by those rotors, that can cause serious damage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Human or dog. Cool. So here's something from Kevin Hamilton who says, oh, that's the second part of the question. Let me find the first part here. Some people spend large portion of their lives and fortunes searching for cryptids and the unusual with no luck. Why do some other folks seem to easily have so many encounters almost by accident? And he follows up with, I didn't mean my question to suggest that people with lots of encounters are being disingenuous. I just wonder why there's something about those people that draws cryptids to them somehow.
Well, I was talking to another interview, and she basically said that certain people are like magnets for the cryptids and paranormal. And she thought that maybe I was one of them because, as I said, not just Sasquatch. I've seen ghosts, I've seen orbs, I've seen UFOs. I think certain people just have that aura and attract these different things. I don't do it on purpose, but it definitely happens. So,
yeah, I mean, I've heard that. I think overwhelmingly the reports I've heard are people having that one-time sort of encounter. Just something happens and that haunts them for the rest of their life. Either that's just a story that they keep kind of hidden for fear of ridicule, and then there's the folks that actually are intrepid enough to go look into the stuff. But I've definitely come across folks as well who seem to have had encounters with more than one thing, so to speak. And I don't know if I'd really consider myself in that camp. I've just had a random array of things happen. Nothing visual aside from UFO type stuff, as I've talked about previously. But it is interesting. So what do you think ultimately about, I'll get to some other questions, but ultimately, what do you think about just the Bridgewater Triangle in general? You were saying how you thought you had some theories about portals, but is that your kind of working theory, or what
no, it's just one. It was actually brought up on Paranormal Portal, that it could be a portal. And as I said, I didn't really believe in that at the time, but I'm starting to think that maybe portals do exist, but it's such a large area anyway that it's very easy for things to hide in an area. I actually have someone I know that lives up near Bar Harbor, and they were staying at a house in Southwest Harbor, actually. Very, Acadian National Park, very populated area, tons of tourists and everything. For a month, he was getting all kinds of Sasquatch activity at this particular place that he was at. And somebody questioned it. It's like, I've been up there all the time. They said, I never see anything like that. I'm like, well, it happens when it happens. And if you're in the right place at the right time, it's going to happen. So as far as the Hockomock Swamp, as I said, it's just a huge area, and I'm sure that there's plenty of places to hide in there.
Definitely. Like I said, just even flying a drone over the area, there's some spots that are really deep. I mean, Massachusetts is a very populated state. And I think even, you know, 40, 50 years ago, there was a little bit more rural nature to some of these areas. But even now, you still have huge swaths of land. I mean, the Freetown State Forest is another one. We were there. I had not spent a whole lot of time in there, but we were there as we were filming for our Pukwudgie episode for Chasing Legends. And we actually had a Jeep coincidentally rented. And it was kind of funny. You're renting a Jeep from Massachusetts, you're not really going to need it. And then we ended up going on some of these back roads that, my God, they would rival any other, you know, any place in New Hampshire or Maine in terms of terrain. You couldn't get through with, like I wouldn't be able to get through with my RAV4. It's either a Jeep or a truck, and that's it. And there's some woods back there, and that's why there's a lot of these horrible things that have happened over the years in that spot. People being taken out there to be killed, the mafia, mob activity, because it's so remote. So you can imagine all these other stories. Now, have you looked into the Freetown State Forest or spent any time?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've actually, I actually watched the Bridgewater Triangle documentary, and you know, they did the episode on the Freetown Forest. And yeah, I've actually looked into different stories that come out of there too. I usually stick with Sasquatch, Bigfoot type of things, though. Not as much really comes out of there about that. So, but yeah, it's pretty fascinating. You know, area too.
Definitely. I think that's one of the things is when you're looking into Sasquatch, and you always kind of run into other stuff. There's other stories that are told, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's one thing we ran into with the Pukwudgie was hearing about, you know, the Pukwudgie. That's more what we're interested in, but you hear the stories about the satanic cult activity or the mafia murders and the weird stuff that's happened there over the years that, I mean, you could say is paranormal, but involves, you know, real consequences, people being found dead, and lots of other gruesome things out in the woods out there.
And they, you know, with that brings a bad aura too in areas like that. So that could be part of it.
Right. Well, like we said, even with the whole Bridgewater Triangle, the idea of the curse put on by Native Americans, or just the bloodshed, the amount of suffering that was on that land with the settlers and the natives fighting for such a long time, a very bloody conflict. And that's, you know, ultimately where kind of the birth of the country was in a lot of ways, or at least the settling of this area.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very interesting. Cool. So let's see. We're going to keep going with some questions here. Thank you to Jack Bisson. Thanks for the $10. Appreciate that, man. Great show, guys.
Jack is actually a friend of mine.
Very cool.
He's actually going to be accompanying me on these trips into the Hockomock.
Awesome. Yeah. Stay safe, guys. I think it's harder to see something if you're not looking for it. Okay, yeah, that's interesting comment by Chris there. Let's see here. I was trying to pull up this question, but they keep scrolling so fast. Okay, here we go. Mr. Foster, how many reports do you get of Dogman, Mothman, and other cryptids that you might think are actually Bigfoot reports?
Actually, there really hasn't been, as far as the Hockomock Swamp, any reports of Mothman or Dogman. I haven't come across one, but
yeah.
I don't know. As far as other areas like New Jersey and stuff like that, they could be Sasquatches or Bigfoots. You know, a lot of people get confused with the Dogman. Well, I should step back a minute. In the Hockomock Swamp, there's been a lot of reports of these hounds, these devil dogs.
Right.
But no one has ever seen them actually, you know, stand up and walk on 2 feet. So I haven't heard any reports of dogmen coming out of there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the Mothman stuff, the only thing I can think of is, like you said, the thunderbird sort of stuff. People seeing winged. I don't know if any of it really looked humanoid, but winged kind of large bird-like creatures.
You know, and also pterodactyl reports come out of there too. So
right, prehistoric-looking birds.
Yep,
that sort of stuff. Very interesting. One of my, in terms of the Bigfoot stuff, I think the Raynham Dog Track, or the dog park, whatever they're calling it now.
Yeah,
there's a lot of encounters in that area, correct?
Oh yeah, there's been a lot of sightings, and actually a lot of UFO sightings too when the track was open. people would see orbs while they were watching the dogs, and um, giant triangular UFOs actually flying overhead. So, but yeah, there's been Sasquatches running around the fence along the dog track there.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah,
was going to mention, yeah, one of the stories I had heard back in the day from a friend of mine who researched this back in the 2000s and the 90s was they had seen apparently some of the dog handlers had seen like a Bigfoot like creature leaning over the fence there, actually looking at some of the dogs, which is interesting. We talk about dogs and field research and Bigfoot.
yeah, yeah. I've actually heard those stories.
It's a cool area. There's that nature trail that goes from around where the dog track is really to the power lines, and I don't know how many miles it is, but if you go, and especially now, it's going to be all green and overgrown. I mean, you won't be able to see 5 feet into the woods there, but in the wintertime, it's a little bit easier to see through some of the trees, but you can still see how much, ice and water there really is in there that, you don't want to actually walk right into that area. You might actually fall in.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
And that's a cool area. So, Crash Course Cryptozoology asks, has Kevin ever come across pukwudgie stories? Considering the Hockomock Swamp has such an unusual array of reports, what's the strangest Bigfoot report he's heard?
Well, I can tell you first off, the strangest pukwudgie story I heard was a guy was walking his dog, I think early in the morning before the sun came up, and he was just walking along the street at the edge of the Hockomock Swamp, and I think he was coming down this circular area, and under the street light, he saw what he thought was like an otter. And he got closer, and all of a sudden, it just started chanting to him and going something like "E-Y-E, E-Y-E," and he got closer and closer, and it was a pukwudgie. Um, he ended up turning around and taking off. He was pretty scared, but that was the strangest story I'd ever heard. As far as weirdest story about Bigfoot was, I think it was somebody had a farm and they heard a racket at night, and they went out, and the farmer saw this huge creature with two of his like 400-pound pigs under each arm, and he just took off and walked into the swamp with them. That was the strangest story I've heard. I actually put it in my book too. I mean,
Wow.
and
That's pretty neat.
yeah, it was pretty cool.
Do you know what year that happened in or when it happened?
No, because I've come across so much stuff. It's I'm not sure what year that was. It was a while ago. I think it was like 20 years ago, though.
Right, right. Yeah, I think a lot of the really interesting reports happened earlier. I know of one that I was told by my friend John Horrigan, who, as I mentioned, kind of looked into this stuff back in the day. It was a story of police officers that had
Yes.
the woman with the chickens were being taken, and they had the
Yep.
back of the car lifted up.
Yep. Yeah. He was sitting at, I don't know, a dead end,
Yep.
and out of the woods came a Sasquatch and lifted up the back of his police cruiser and slammed it down. And I think he took off right away.
Wow. Yeah, I always heard of that story, and then actually, when we were filming our Pukwudgie episode back in March, we were interviewing a friend of mine, Paul Eno, of Rhode Island, who's also looked into a lot of the Pukwudgie and stuff in the Bridgewater Triangle. He's right in Woonsocket, so he's not too far from that area in Rhode Island. And he said he actually interviewed one of the cops who had that encounter happen to them with the back of the car. So I'm gonna have to when I get him on the show, I'll have to get him to talk about that. But lots of really cool stories coming out of that area. Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's stories of I don't know. I think it was two older women were sitting on their porch at dusk one night at the edge of the swamp, and they just heard this like very loud flapping sound, and they looked up and they saw a pterodactyl flying like right over their house. You know, came out of the swamp, flew over the house, and took off. There's just so many stories that come out of there.
Yeah, absolutely. Very weird stuff. So Glenn H asks, any info on the recent Class A sighting in Savoy State Park?
I'm not sure where that is.
So yeah, that one was actually in Western Massachusetts. Yeah, that was the Squatchachusetts guys. If you go to their Facebook page, Squatchachusetts. You can look up stuff. I know John Wilk, who I've had on the show before, he was talking about it. It was funny, actually. He texted me when that happened because about a month ago, when we were filming On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey with Seth and the Small Town Monsters guys, we were in that park and we walked for a couple miles with the whole crew after dark. And he texted me saying, there's been a Class A sighting basically in the same area that we were walking in the state park. And I was like, oh man, obviously the timing was wrong because, we were there filming and we had nothing. It was dead silent the whole night. But Glenn H., if you go check out the Squatchachusetts Facebook page, they have some info on that. They do a lot of the reports more out in the western and central part of the state. I know Dave McCullough, he does a little bit of the Bridgewater Triangle stuff too as well in the Hockomock. But yeah, pretty cool that happened. So Critter Hunter says, one of my top 2 favorite Bigfoot podcasts. Well, thank you. By the way, naturalist Gareth Patterson, who discovered elephants in Southeast Africa, is reporting upright ape sightings there called Otang. Very interesting stuff, has books. Wow, very cool.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of those reports from around the world of things that are different than the local primates. I mean, in some of these areas, the only primates you have a lot of the monkey species, but you also have things like the orang pendek, which is reported as upright creature in an area where orangutans live, but the locals differentiate them. Even in Africa, I know there's been upright primate sort of sightings that people differentiate from gorillas even and chimps, which is interesting. It's an interesting world out there for these sorts of things, I have to say. Yeah, so what about the book specifically do you want to talk about? Do you want to say a little bit why you came up with the concept to do a fictional story about the swamp, and kind of what was the inspiration behind Strange Days in the Hockomock Swamp?
Well, I actually, it's a fictional story, but I took a lot of my own encounters and put it into the storyline. I also used a lot of different things I've read all over the country about Sasquatch encounters and the Hockomock Swamp, and I put a little twist on it and came up with the story. I mean, the story basically is about a girl camping out in her backyard with her 2 brothers, and she gets dragged into the swamp by a Sasquatch. A hunter comes along and rescues her, and the 2 of them fight their way out of the Hockomock Swamp, encountering all these different creatures that we've been talking about to get out of the swamp. So, as I said, I used a lot of my own encounters, and I used a lot of what I read to come up with the story. And right now I'm working on trying to get it made into either a TV series or a movie. So
that'd be cool.
Any producers are out there interested, let me know.
Right. And I think this question goes perfectly with that. Bigfoot Forest, Vancouver Island asks, hey, Alex, is Kevin's book Strange Days in the Hockomock Swamp available online? Thanks, Lindy.
It's on Amazon, so yeah, you can get it as an ebook.
Cool. I think I have the link to it in the description below. If not, I will add it in after the show. But definitely check it out. I mean, it sounds like a pretty interesting read. The area, it's filled, as we've been talking about, it's filled with all sorts of stories. So I kind of like that you took all the different things and kind of combined it into sort of an adventure tale.
Yeah, it was something to do during the winter time. And I'm actually thinking of coming out with a second book called Darker Days in the Hockomock Swamp, which I might start this winter.
Cool. So when did you actually write the first book?
It came out a year ago in May.
Cool.
After my last encounter that happened 3 years ago. So
awesome. And so since then, since getting into writing, you've also continued the research. Have you had anything interesting happen, or where have you kind of been mostly focusing on it? Has it been the Hockomock, or as you said, have you been doing a little bit of Maine, Vermont, other areas as well?
Well, the thing is, I have 2 sons that live up in Maine, so I travel up there a lot, and I've actually had different things I've found up in Bar Harbor. I've found broken tree limbs. I found these huge rock formations on top of one of the mountains there. I have it on videotape. And I like I said, I was trying to get into the Hockomock Swamp in April, but things just got messed up because my plan was to go to a campground and spend a week there and keep going into the swamp, and they just opened up like July 1st. So I'm waiting to see what happens and see if I can get back in there
Yeah,
and hopefully do some kayak excursions through there.
right. Yeah.
But I was going to say I am planning a trip in about 2 weeks to go back up to Maine, and I'm going to do some more research up there.
Definitely. Maine is such a great spot, and it's something I've talked about a lot on this program. And a while ago, we had Michelle Soulier on, who's writing a book, after 10 plus years of work on Bigfoot encounters in Maine. I think Maine is just one of the perfect states for something like this creature to live. I love going up to Maine. I'll actually be going up to Maine this weekend doing some camping, and I was there a couple weeks ago, and it's just I love it. I mean, even as a New Hampshire guy, we have plenty of woods like Maine, but they just have a lot more of it.
Mm. And there's a lot of stories that come out of Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
much woods, so many mountains, logging communities up there, a lot of wilderness people, whether we're talking hikers, backpackers, fishing, hunting, basically everything. And those are the kinds of people that have a lot of these encounters, even people just passing through the area.
Yeah, it's funny, just real quick. I live on Cape Cod, and in talking to my next door neighbor, they have a place up in Maine, and they've actually had numerous encounters at this place that they just bought. And she found out I wrote the book, and we just started talking about it. It's just amazing how many different people you encounter that have these different experiences.
Right.
And a lot of them don't want to talk about it. She was one of them, didn't want to talk about it. But she heard I wrote the book, and she opened up and started telling me these stories. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love that a lot of these people don't like to talk, especially in New England, where it's not like in California or Washington, where there's Bigfoot burgers and Bigfoot everything all over the place, where it's culturally acceptable to talk about Bigfoot. In New England, there's still a bit of a stigma for a lot of these sorts of things. So people are a bit maybe more conservative about talking about these sorts of things, a little bit more taboo. So it's always interesting when you do get people to open up, or they hear you're into this kind of stuff and they start telling you their stories. I've had that happen a few times, but that's very cool that you've had that happen too, and especially for something like Maine.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is too, I mean, I sat on my encounters for over 20 years. I didn't open up about it until I had my other encounter 3 years ago, and then decided to write the book, and that's when I started talking about these things.
Yeah, right. So there you go, another example of that.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So you mentioned Cape Cod. Obviously, Cape Cod is filled with great white sharks now, which is something that I'm interested in as well.
Yeah, I've seen one. I don't know. I think 2 years ago, just because I was up in the Orleans area, and he was chasing a seal. I mean, so.
This is just it's like a side passion I have aside from cryptozoology. I love all wildlife and nature in general, not just cryptids. I love the ones that are documented or whatever we want to say. But great whites, I remember 2 years ago when there was those 2 attacks in the summer, and that kid unfortunately was killed by a great white. I went to that beach and I interviewed a local surfer, and they were talking about seeing him. And my goal this summer is hopefully to make it down there to the Cape at least once and get a drone shot of a great white, maybe just swimming or checking it out.
That'd be cool. Yeah.
Yeah. I have the app. You can have the Sharktivity app, which is by the, I think they're called the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy Group.
Yep. That's right.
I think they're in Chatham or something like that.
Yeah.
Awesome app. I always get, it's almost daily now. I'll get the text notifications telling me there's been a shark spotted on Newcomb Hollow Beach closed for an hour or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Well, I do a lot of snorkeling, and I actually have underwater video equipment. I'm a videographer by trade, so nice. I don't think I'll be going there to try to get a great white, but I get some good footage once in a while.
Right. Well, be careful. And obviously this week, up in Maine had its first shark-related fatality. The woman from New York City that was attacked by a great white.
Where was this? I didn't hear about this.
Oh, this happened just a few days ago. It was somewhere south of Acadia. I don't remember where exactly.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, it was all over the news in Maine. They were talking about it because it was just such a rare incident. And people were saying, there are lots of sightings of great whites in Maine, but a lot of the fishermen, so the tourists don't usually see it because they don't they don't usually go out to those areas. The tourists, there's so many islands up in Maine. It's not like on the Cape where you have the beach and
Clusters
open.
of people. Yeah.
Right. So I'm looking I have the app pulled up here. I'm looking at the Maine coast. You can kind of zoom out, and this is
Yep. I know where
this is
that
the whole area. So I'm looking, trying to see where that attack happened. I believe it was.
looks like the Penobscot area.
So there was a seal found murdered actually on the beach there in
Wow.
Thumbcap Island. So yeah, so check that app out. It's really cool.
Okay. Yeah, I will.
That's a sidetrack. But yeah, be careful if you're going out there in the water.
That's why I use my snorkel stuff. I like to see what's coming at me. I don't want to be blind swimming out there. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know. Props to you, because once I know that there's something like a shark in the water, I'm definitely not going to want to go in there.
Well, I kind of felt about like that when I was walking in the woods too, when I started seeing Sasquatches,
Right.
Second thoughts about going in there, but
yeah. See, that's it's funny though. There's something about the water, and maybe that's just, a lot of people are scared of the water. I've actually been shark cage diving with great white sharks, and you have a degree of separation, but you have to have respect for these creatures. They're absolutely magnificent, and if they wanted to end you in a moment, they could.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to have that balance. And something like a Sasquatch, or even some of these other things, I'm sure it's the same sort of way. And that's something I've heard time and time again, is if this thing wanted to kill me, it easily could.
Yeah, I definitely believe that.
So Kevin says, I must be the only guy that's never heard of a pukwudgie. Lol. It's a bit of a, it can be obscure, but I think a lot of folks in the cryptid community have heard about it. It's made its way into Harry Potter and other folklore as well.
Yeah, it's an elf-like creature and 3 feet tall, and sometimes they're clothed, sometimes they're naked. I've even heard that some carry bow and arrows.
Right,
I've heard stories about that, so it's just a strange phenomenon.
Yeah, it's an old Wampanoag story.
Yeah.
Chris Comier says, hey guys, what about Monsterland? So Monsterland is up near the Leominster area. That's an area locals have been calling it that since I think the 40s. I know Ronnie LeBlanc, who has talked about that a lot. He wrote a book on it, and he's going to be on the show in September. They're filming Expedition Bigfoot right now. So he was supposed to be on the show in July, but they got busy with their filming. So he'll be on. We can talk about Monsterland then. But yeah, Leominster State Forest, another weird area in Massachusetts where there's a lot of woods and a lot of weird stories of orbs and Bigfoot-like creatures being seen in that area. So here, Peter Birdsall says, I read Kevin's book. It's good for those new to all this for a fiction read.
Oh, good. Thank you, Peter.
Very cool. So yeah, I mean, it's almost like a little bit of a primer, perhaps, to maybe make it a little easier for folks that are not into cryptids, that those of us that are into it, we can read a book that just kind of talks right about what's been going on in the area, but maybe this is a way to kind of ease people into what's going on. Raptor Crazy says, question for both of you guys. What would you guys recommend for someone to get into the field of research for Bigfoot and other cryptids?
I would say just start getting out into the woods. Find out where some of the hot spots are and follow that area. I don't know where you're from, but there's reports all over the states. So just get out there.
Definitely, I would agree. Just start looking at some of the local areas. It's not going to be hard to find unless you're maybe in the cornfields of Iowa. It's not going to be too hard to find Bigfoot encounters or reports, at least in your areas, and get out in the woods. But do your research, learn about those encounters, learn about the local wildlife, find out what's in your area, so that if you do have an encounter with something, it may be something that's you're able to identify. Not everything that moves out there is Bigfoot or anything else. So just stay vigilant, I suppose, when you're out there as well. And Peter also followed up with, Kevin does incorporate nearly all the varied creatures in his book native to said swamp.
Yep. Thank you.
Very cool. Okay, here's another one from Kevin. If someone funded an expedition for either of you and gave you unlimited resources, equipment, and time, what area of the world would you choose for your attempt to find indisputable proof of Bigfoot?
Wow, I got the whole world to choose from.
That's a tough one.
I think I'd concentrate more on Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. I thought I would head to. I actually retired like 3 years ago, And my goal was to buy an RV and head to Florida and start looking for the skunk ape. Because when I was retiring, my big joke was I'm going to be the guy that gets the proof of Bigfoot and go from there. But I think I'd concentrate on the northern New England states because there's so many reports that come out of there right now.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a tough question. Like you said, there's so many good areas to choose from, and I've been lucky enough to go to a lot of these cool spots. I mean, I would probably have to say the same thing, either New Hampshire or Vermont, areas that I'm more familiar with. Maybe spend a couple weeks just living in one particular area and just seeing what happens. I mean, I think ultimately maybe you might bring something in, or will it be possible to get indisputable proof? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, we have lots of people that have tried, but I don't think anyone's ever had an unlimited funds expedition. So maybe something like New Hampshire, Vermont, or I would pick somewhere out west where you have really more of an isolated area where there's a lot of activity, like even the Mogollon Rim that we were on recently. It seems like a lot of the encounters happen in this area. It is a vast area, but there's still sort of like zones where there tend to be activity. So I know that's a bit of a cop-out answer saying multiple locations, but it's hard to pick. So Jack says we are going to take the Mavic 2 Enterprise with thermal imaging into the swamp soon. Ah, sweet. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as I said, back in April, May, we were kind of planning this to, he has a drone, I have a drone, and we were going to just start flying the drones through the area and see what we can find.
Right. I love using the drones. I have a Mavic as well. It's not one that has thermal on it, but I just love throwing it up there and getting some scenic shots of an area, or even just scouting the location. It kind of tells you, oh, there's a swamp over here, or there's a cliff over here, or whatever you're looking at. It's just a very useful tool. Jack then follows up and saying, we'll be on the swamp on foot as well. The drones are just useful tools to help investigate.
Exactly. Yep.
Couldn't agree more. And I couldn't agree more with this as well with Kevin. I'm very comfortable in the bush. The ocean scares the bejesus out of me. If it's clear, blue water, and you can see 100 feet beneath you, I'm fine with that. But when it gets murky, I'm a little, especially if I know that there's something like a great white nearby. Definitely not great, but.
Well, I'll tell you a little story about Jack there. He won't even go fishing on a dock. He is so fearful of sharks. So Sorry, Jack.
Well, they're definitely nothing to be messed with, as I said earlier. Got to show respect to them. They're the top predator out there.
Yeah, they are.
Kaidiak says, I had an encounter on the Fire Road in the Hockomock.
Wow.
Oh, cool. Well, if you want to share a Kaidiak, you can type in your encounter or email one of us or both of us if you want to tell your story more in detail. I'm sure Kevin would probably love to hear what you have to say.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, and Peter says he's spelled my name wrong. That's fine. But he says, Alex and Kevin, I love to help either of you. Please contact me if interested. Okay.
Okay.
So Stefan, he says, so no cliff jumping into dark water. He's poking a little fun at me. We were up in the White Mountains this weekend, and we did a little hike, and then we went swimming in this river right outside of Lincoln, and there's this cliff, and there's this really big, deep, dark pool, and it wasn't so much the dark water that scared me jumping in there. It was the cliff itself. It was a very sketchy spot to get to, and I almost slipped. Where you're wet, you're barefoot, you're walking around these big granite cliffs. I mean, it was just a little bit kind of scary. So, yeah, no cliff jumping into dark water. If it's blue water and I can see in it, that would be great. But Jack says I like to be on the ground. I'm sure a lot of people agree. So this is a good question from Critter Hunter. He asks, either of you ever go to police stations in rural towns to dig through very old police reports? Heard a guy found one where a person hit one years ago and they found blood and hair on a wrecked car.
I haven't actually gone to police stations, but I've come across police reports online, a couple encounters. So, and something very similar that somebody had hit one with their car. Was the report I came across.
He followed up with it. They couldn't ID. This was before DNA. Sounds like a great idea. I mean, I don't know how receptive the police might be to kind of coming in there and requesting that, but something I might certainly try. I was hoping to spend this summer doing a little bit of research here in local libraries and small towns in New Hampshire, just digging up, seeing if there's any local history about reports or stories even before the Bigfoot days. But as we've said, the whole COVID thing kind of put a
Mm.
halt on a lot of this sort of stuff, which is unfortunate. Oh, Stefan asked, any ocean cryptids off coastal towns in New England?
Oh yeah, there have been sea serpent reports off in Massachusetts. Lots of them. Um,
Yeah, the Gloucester sea serpent is a very
yeah,
famous
Gloucester
one
sea
from
serpent.
1800s. I know in Connecticut there's even giant squid seen. There's all sorts of strange encounters of that sort, and but yeah, definitely a lot of those. I'll tell you more about those later, Stefan. But E-Man says a lot of police stations try to keep things quiet.
Mm.
I can imagine. I mean, you don't really want to create a panic about something like a hairy ape-like creature running around town, even though in some cases, like in a place like Whitehall, you have multiple police officers seeing something strange. Kevin says, I would imagine it'd be very daunting to walk into a police station and start asking about Bigfoot-related incidents.
They'll probably throw you in a cell.
Yeah, I don't imagine that would go too well. Maybe if you have a connection or something, know a cop, have him put in a good word or give you some access or something. I don't know the legalities behind that, but definitely would be interesting. But anyway, do you want to just say something else about, kind of where people can find you and anything like that?
Yeah, I have a Facebook page. My name, Kevin J. Foster. Also, Strange Days in the Hockomock Swamp is on Facebook. The book's on Amazon. You can buy the book or you can get the ebook either way. Um, but that's pretty much it.
Cool. And as you mentioned, you're planning to do an expedition to the Hockomock. Anything else you've got planned?
As I said, hopefully this winter I might actually start the second book, and but I'm spending more time trying to get a lawyer or find a producer or something to turn this first book into something. So that's kind of what I'm concentrating on.
Yeah, and I can imagine if they're doing kind of a show about the Bridgewater Triangle, that might bring a lot of attention to it. So you may have an opportunity to kind of pitch
Yeah.
your story and get a network that might be attracted. So definitely sounds interesting. So in closing, what would you say to people that are interested in checking out the Hockomock Swamp? What would be just some advice, just in general?
Well, number one, don't go in there alone. I would definitely go with some people. There's so many stories now with the 411 phenomenon, people disappearing, and my personal belief is part of it has to do with Sasquatch activity. So just get out there, and if you hear reports in certain areas that you're close by to, get out there and look.
Right.
You might be in the right place at the right time, and that's just kind of how it works for me.
Yeah, definitely be careful out there as well, just in a safety standpoint. As mentioned, there's been people that have gone missing, but people have gotten lost. I read a report from a couple of years ago. It was a news report actually about some kids that had gotten lost out there. They went the wrong trail, and it was in the winter, so it was starting to get cold, and they managed to be rescued. So that just goes to show, even though this area is just south of Boston, maybe 30, 40 minutes, there's still a lot of wild areas and a lot of places people can get lost. I mean, people get lost in the Blue Hills,
Yeah.
right south of Boston. So I'm sure some of the areas you've been up in Maine and New Hampshire and spots I go to, I mean, I think these people might not stand a chance if they're getting lost in a smaller area like the Blue Hills or even the Hockomock, but it definitely is not a place to be trifled with. Like I said, there's probably quicksand and lots of other dangerous conditions in there too. So just be careful. Well, thanks for coming on, Kevin. Appreciate that.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Just some closing comments. Kevin says, another great episode. Cheers, boys.
Thank you.
Jack says, great show. Thank you, Jack. Critter Hunter, it's always good podcast. This and Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo are my favorites. Oh, I really appreciate that. Those are great guys. Check out their show too. Well, thanks again. So, guys, remember next week we are having on Paul Bartholomew. We're going to be talking about Bigfoot in the Northeast, so more of the Whitehall, Vermont area. Paul has been on the scene for a long time. Just had the chance to meet him recently. Fantastic guy. Can't wait to talk to him about Bigfoot and Champ and other stuff. So Thank you guys for tuning into another show. Thanks for your great questions for myself and our guest, Kevin. And check him out. Links to his stuff below. And we'll see you guys next week. Have a good night.